Good afternoon and welcome to the final event on the FinTech and Financial Services stage here on day 3 of CogX. This is the last and perhaps the greatest of all of the sessions in the FinTech and Financial Services channel, so I'm delighted you're joining us here today. My name is Ben Brabin and I've spent 20 years in FinTech. I built and sold a crowdfunding business and have more recently been running Level 39, a cluster of FinTech and cybersecurity companies in Canary Wharf in East London. More recently, though, during the COVID era, I've been focusing on questions of mutuality, how it is that we help technology businesses and society reconnect with each other. So I'm particularly interested by this session, not least because the question of mutuality, the question of how to deal with the fact that artificial intelligence increasingly looks through the veil of ignorance, enables insurers to see things that maybe we wouldn't want them to see, or at least act upon. Well, that's what we're about to find out. We're being led in this process by the organization which really sits at the heart of the UK's response to the challenges and opportunities of AI. We are hosted by Alex from the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. Alex, it's a great pleasure. Over to you.
Thanks, Ben. My name is Alex Lawrence Archer, and I'm the COO of the CDEI. As Ben indicated, we're an advisory body set up by the UK government, and we advise on AI ethics, risks, opportunities, that kind of thing. In a previous life, I did actually work for an insurtech, and last year I worked with colleagues on a paper that the CDEI put out on this topic. But I myself am really not an expert on insurance at all. So luckily, we are joined today by 3 people who are experts who are going to help us kind of unpack some of these issues properly. The first of those is Edy Li Klinger. Hi, Ed.
Hello. Would you like me to give a quick introduction?
Yeah.
So my name's Edy Li Klinger. I'm the CEO of a company called Flock. We're a UK insurtech based here in London, obviously all working remotely right now. We insure around 1/3 of the UK's drone flights, and we approach insurance in a very different way. Rather than selling traditional annual policies, we sell insurance by the hour. So we break down the insurance underwriting process and assess risk on a per flight basis, so that for any given drone flight, we will ingest vast amounts of data relating to weather, location, drone data, pilot data, and so on, to assess the risk of that given flight and price it in real time. And now we insure thousands of businesses here in the UK and across Europe and now in Asia. And I'll be talking quite a bit about how we actually go about that and what the implications are, both from an ethical perspective and also for the future of the industry. I also chair the UK InsurTech Board, which brings together a range of stakeholders in the insurance space to further the aims of the UK InsurTech sector.
Great, thanks, Ed. We're also joined by Orlando Machado. It's going to pop up now. Hi, Orlando.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. My name's Orlando Machado. I am Chief Data Scientist for Aviva. You probably know Aviva, a very big global insurance company headquartered in London. And my Chief Data Scientist is about trying to push our data science capability forward. And that could be about using new technology, new techniques, new data, but also increasingly partnerships. So we partner with technology companies. We also partner with academic institutions. So we have a very big partnership with Cambridge University, which is intended to help us research areas that are emerging. And some of the areas of data science are emerging very, very fast. In past lives, I've been Chief Data Scientist at Money Supermarket, so the biggest price comparison site in the UK. And I also worked at dunnhumby, which is best known for powering the data science that sits behind Tesco's Club Card. Thank you.
Thanks, Orlando. And then last by no means least, saving the best for last, in fact, Melissa Collett, and who's going to pop up now. Hi, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I'm Melissa Collett, and I'm Professional Standards Director at the Chartered Insurance Institute. The Chartered Insurance Institute is a professional body which is dedicated to building public trust in the insurance sector. We award globally recognized qualifications, and we have over 128,000 members worldwide. My role is focused on building, promoting, and protecting professional standards in the sector. And one of the key areas of focus for me at the moment is the rise of insurtech and the opportunities and risks that it brings to insurance and the ethical questions that it raises for the profession. In my previous life, I was an insurance lawyer, ombudsman, and judge.
Thank you, Melissa. Super. So that's everyone introduced. And as Melissa pointed out to me when we were speaking before this, we've got quite good spread of representation. So we've got a sort of innovator, we've got someone from risk carrier, and we've got someone representing the profession, which is great. We are missing the regulatory perspective, and no doubt we will come on to that a bit and where that comes in as we go on. So I kind of wanted to start by unpacking the title of this discussion really a bit. I think it's a kind of provocative title, Insuring the Uninsurable, what happens when our fates can be foretold, and it needs a bit of examining. It refers to a kind of technical and I think kind of complicated idea that's been around for a few years about how AI might undermine how insurance works in a fairly fundamental way. And Ben was referring to the veil of ignorance when he introduced us as well. So I'm going to drop Orlando in it first and see if Orlando can start us off in kind of talking us through what this thing is that people are kind of worried about in terms of how AI might sort of undermine how insurance works.
Yeah, I mean, I'll certainly give it a go. I mean, it comes down to the fundamental concept of what insurance is and when insurance can actually function properly. Because insurance makes sense if you can get a situation where the premiums of the many will pay for the claims of the few. That's really the situation. Everybody needs to pay in. And so lots of people pay in and then a few people claim. And that's how the kind of system works. And I think for that to work, there has to be some kind of degree of uncertainty. So we have to know we have to be unsure about who's going to be in the many versus who's going to be in the few. The other aspect to that, though, is actually how do we charge for insurance and what's a fair way of charging for insurance? And insurance kind of started with everybody paying the same. But that leads to a challenge around people who are lower risk subsidizing people who are higher risk. And to some people, that doesn't really seem fair. So it got to a situation where actually we're trying to understand and estimate the risk that people put into the pot and then help the situation because we want people to pay broadly in proportion to the risks that they contribute. And so a good example is that if you drive many, many more miles, you're slightly more likely to have a car accident. And so it's kind of fair that you pay a little bit more for your car insurance. And so a lot of the business of running an insurance company is trying to anticipate and predict risk and trying to predict the risk that an individual will contribute to a pool of risk. And the challenge that I think we're thinking about today is about the extreme version of that. What happens if you get so good at predicting risks that you understand exactly the claims experience that's going to happen to somebody in the future? And so does that lead to a situation where you're trying to charge somebody the cost of a claim, which essentially takes away the point of insurance? And in practice, that means that people become uninsurable, which is an outcome that nobody really wants. So to some extent, that's always been the challenge of insurance, trying to get the trade-off between everybody paying the same and everybody paying purely in proportion to their risk, and trying to get the sweet spot where that seems fair. It seems like a sustainable system without people unfairly subsidizing people that are contributing a lot more risk than them. And so the question I think today is that in what ways can AI compromise that situation or upset the balance that we're trying to get with the situation right now?
Great. So there's the sort of less risky people who, if they really knew how little risk they presented, they might not bother with insurance. And then you've got the very risky people who, if we really knew how risky they were, they'd find it very difficult. And we're trying to find, as you said, a sort of balance or a sweet spot in which they can be sort of live together in kind of like market conditions. Did anyone else want to come in on that? I thought that was quite clear. I got it. Did anyone else want to come in on that particular bit and sort of unpack the thing that people have been scared about in terms of AI and insurance?
I think that was an excellent summary. I think there's a lot more in terms of what people might be worried about, which we'll probably touch on today. I think the issue of data collection and transparency is going to be a really interesting topic for discussion over the next few years, helping customers understand what data is being used to actually assess their risk in a hyper-personalized way, and ensuring that we have, as insurers or as insurance providers, actually the permission to collect and use that data in the way that it is being collected and used. So that's going to certainly be a contentious ethical and moral issue, which will rear its head. It already has, in fact. I'm going to take a relatively optimistic stance on today's call, and I'm going to focus on how AI and technology in general can actually empower customers to reduce their own risks.
Great. Okay. We'll make sure that we get on then to some of those questions as well. Ed, I was hoping to stick with you a bit. We've talked about the sort of thing that people are scared of, and it really relies on an idea that AI is going to be used in a really fundamental way kind of across the insurance sector, and to do really sophisticated risk pricing at the individual level. And I guess having established that that's the thing that people are worried about, it's worth unpacking a bit. Is that realistic? Is that happening in the insurance sector? Is it likely to happen in the next couple of years? Don't want to do too much future gazing, but we can talk about kind of two or 3 year time horizon. So what's your take on where we're actually seeing AI being developed and deployed in the sector?
Yeah, so we don't even need to future gaze at all. We can have a look at what's going on today, and it's only going to get more interesting over the next few years. So this idea of hyper-personalized risk profiles is certainly going to be one of the things we're talking about for the next few years, and it's going to become a very interesting space. I can speak from my own experience running Flock. We are actively embracing this methodology. What we've done at Flock is we've realized that in the drone industry, it's difficult to build a risk profile for a customer because there's not an enormous amount of historical data that you can actually use to predict risk in the future. If you're in certain industries, you can look back 20, 30, 50 years and say, well, we have a pattern of risk and we can start to understand what risks look like and bucket these risks effectively. We simply don't have that timeline in the drone space. It's virtually brand new. So what we've done at Flock is we've built these hyper customized policies which ingest your location, the time of flight, data from your drone, data from you as a pilot, to produce a hyper customized risk profile, not just for you as a customer, but actually for the specific risk that you as a customer are insuring in the exact moment that you insure it. And to make this very real, a flight in the middle of a field on a nice summer's day with a cheap drone might cost you £4.95. And some of our customers are flying incredibly complicated equipment in harrowing conditions and are paying several £100s per flight. And so what those hyper customized risk profiles allow us to do is actually segment the market and treat customers fairly by providing them with insurance policies that are fairly priced and which represent the risks that these customers are undertaking. It's not just us doing this. There are a number of organizations, insurtechs and insurers, who are embracing this new methodology of continuous underwriting, whereby risks are continuously assessed and reassessed and priced in real time or otherwise, so that customers pay for the risks that they're actually exposed to. So it's certainly not future gazing. It's happening today.
Great. So there seems to be there's a couple of things going on. It seems to be one is our increasing ability to do very sophisticated analysis on historical data, and then there's something else which is a bit more what you're talking about there, which is we've got many more data sources and we're able to make use of that data much more in real time. Both of them lead us towards the same place in being able to price risk more accurately. But I guess the balance of those will be different in different sectors. So I guess for some of those more traditional verticals like car insurance, that sophisticated analysis of historical data might be more of a factor.
Yes, I think in we call them the kind of emerging industries, the new mobility industries, a really interesting example. If you go on BBC News today, you'll see an article about e-scooters and the legalization of e-scooters and should they be allowed on public roads, and it's all kicking off and it's going to happen in the next few months. That represents a problem and an opportunity for insurance companies who simply don't have historical data in order to be able to price these new risks. So what do? They go out and they find real-time data from today or from tomorrow that they can use to actually price these risks. They pull telematics data from the devices themselves, and they understand how they're being driven by the individuals who are using them, and they can use this to build more realistic and accurate risk profiles. In the more traditional industries, which have 50, 60 years worth of claims data, you're absolutely right, and I think Orlando would speak beautifully to this, which is that a more a more granular method for ingesting existing data and doing interesting things with that data and extracting insights from that data that traditional insurers have not yet managed to extract, whilst potentially augmenting it with real-time data as well, could be a very interesting route forward. It's in the motor space, for example, there is an enormous amount of data being collected on connected vehicles, which isn't currently being leveraged by insurers for the purpose of more accurate pricing, and that's about to change.
Orlando, did you want to come in there? I mean, like we mentioned motor a couple of times. I don't know if that fits in with your take on the particular sectors where this is happening the most.
Yeah, I mean, I'm true that insurers are trying to get better and better at predicting and understanding risk. I think if you get back to the question of when does that lead to some kind of system breaking down or some kind of problem, the reality is, as long as there's inherent uncertainty in the system, then insurance is protected as a concept, because however good you get at predicting whether somebody's going to have a road traffic accident, it's unlikely to get to 100% accuracy. I think in the home insurance space, we get slightly different situations sometimes, because we get houses that are very near floodplains that are extremely likely to experience flooding. And in those kind of examples, we've had to see cross-industry approaches to try to solve those kind of problems. So we're always, as an industry, on the lookout for these situations where we think the normal mechanics of insurance might be breaking down. And I think in those kind of instances, we need to step in. But I think generally where we see a lot of uncertainty, we see our role as trying to predict that better and better, using as many data sources as possible, with all the kind of considerations around transparency and fairness, and making sure that we're looking after our customers.
Mm. And Melissa, similarly, I don't know whether you came across this when you were doing the work on the digital companion to the Code of Ethics. When you were doing that work, were you seeing professionals from particular parts of the industry or verticals where AI is being implemented more than others?
Yeah, so I think, where I'm coming from with this is, and I'm pleased to say that when we formed our Digital Ethics Forum, I'm very pleased to say Orlando was a part of that, and thank you for that. And I'm very interested in what both Orlando and Ed were talking about, the use of data to predict loss, and this idea that we can turn insurance into a tool for preventing loss from occurring. So it's sort of turning, as we get more hyper personalization, we can, actually help customers take steps to prevent that loss from ever happening, so that it actually changes the nature of paying insurance for a claim that occurs, to actually stopping that claim from occurring in the first place. And I'm really keen on that aspect of this increasing personalization. And I think Orlando makes some really valid points about keeping that customer fairness in mind. And that's why, we set out at the beginning, setting out the kind of issues with hyper personalization. I think that's where the professional body comes into play, because we're there. We have many members who are underwriters. We have qualifications for underwriters, and so really we see our role as helping to guide that part of the sector in terms of what's the most customer centric and fair way of going about that underwriting with the advent of big data. And all of these new data points that's been discussed. So that's how we see our role, and that's why we decided to convene this digital ethics forum of experts, including Orlando. And if I had met Ed before, I would have invited him to join as well. And that's why we produced this companion guide to our Code of Ethics, which we call our digital companion guide. So
great. I might like to come back to the companion guide in a bit more detail later, possibly, certainly if there is time. I guess to wrap up this little bit that we were trying to do, I think, Orlando, you were pointing there towards certainly the way that I have come to understand it, which is to say albeit that the increasing number of connected devices, data points, and sophistication of the way in which we can analyze that data is making us better at distinguishing between different people's risk levels. Fundamentally, it is still something that's probabilistic, and we're not creating crystal balls that can actually allow us to see exactly what's going to happen in the future. And so that fear of a sort of total undermining of the insurance model is probably not one that we're in danger of realizing, at least anytime soon. But it probably, is it fair to say, it does mean that we might see increasing stratification of different risk groups, and therefore certain people moving sort of further away from each other in terms of the risk prices that they're being offered?
I think it's true in some products that there's enough uncertainty there that we're not at risk of undermining the model soon. I think that we can never be complacent about these things, and we need to understand and keep tracking the way that technologies move. But I think that in certain other areas, if you get life insurance, actually we've had to, as an industry, say that we're going to take quite drastic steps to stop the way that we use certain technologies. And if you think about genetic data and its ability to predict health outcomes for people over periods of many, many years, we could absolutely envisage a situation where we could predict a health outcome that would lead to people becoming uninsurable. And we've taken steps to try to prevent that happening as an industry. In parallel to that, we need to understand what the future is. How can we make good use of this data to protect customers and protect the industry and protect all of the financial systems that are such a fundamental part of our society. So in life insurance, actually, I think it's a much more complex situation, and we need to just carry out research, not just insurance companies, but potentially, cross-industry research in partnership with regulators and with government institutions to make sure that customers are protected.
So there are going to be areas, and another one you mentioned there was sort of floodplains, right, where there's had to be sort of concerted action to deal with a problem whereby if it's not certain, it's at least extremely likely that people are going to be facing these kind of risks, and there've had to be sort of ways found around that. Melissa, you've spoken about sort of fairness to customers. I mean, is there a job to do in kind of unpicking the areas and the types of insurance that we're really concerned about here, of people being uneconomical to insure? We've talked about life and home insurance. They seem fairly clear cut. It's really important that people are able to access those. Is there a job to do in kind of unpicking the verticals that we're more worried about when it comes to people being uneconomical to insure?
Well, I think it cuts across almost all forms of insurance. I mean, one of the biggest problems in the past with travel insurance has been access. So access for people with pre-existing health conditions. And I'd like to think that increasing personalization would actually improve access, because it would sort of, instead of having a computer says no tech mentality and just having a blanket ban on anyone who, for instance, suffered cancer in the past, it would actually be able to look at that person's individual circumstances and say, actually, this was a long time ago, or they're having really effective treatment, so we can actually cover this person going forward. So in that sense, it cuts across. It can cut across. I think I can give loads of more examples of how it can cut across all forms of insurance. And let's remember, insurance has an enormous social value. We need that reassurance and peace of mind that insurance offers to protect our income, our assets, and our life and health should the worst happen. And our infrastructure, as Amanda Blanc once said, would grind to a halt without insurance. So we need it to have, all the infrastructure that we rely on. So it really cuts across people and businesses in a way that we can't even begin to, we have to emphasize that. So I think that I wouldn't want to confine it just to motor or life or anything like that. But I would like to emphasize that, obviously I'm very interested in the ethical dimension of this debate and how we can guide professionals to a better outcome. But I'm definitely not, a naysayer or somebody, a doom monger here, because as I've tried to emphasize, I see a lot of positives that could arise for consumers in this increasing use of data. So I think it's about focusing on that and making sure we address any issues that arise as well.
So it sounds like we've got some pretty significant positives that we're quite confident about, and there may be areas in which we are facing some problems around people being very expensive to insure, but those won't necessarily be so different from things that we faced in the past. So Orlando, you've talked about flooding, you've talked about genetic data. I'm wondering where those tricky issues have been tackled in the past by the sector, by insurers, working with customers, regulators, government. How's that worked in the past? And are there sort of lessons that we can draw from those processes that we should be thinking about applying today as we maybe try and deal with some of the issues that AI might be throwing up?
I think the only kind of lesson is to keep an open dialogue that includes regulators. So I think trying to solve this problem as one company on your own, I think, is not a sustainable solution. I think this needs to be about understanding the system, and I think everybody needs to be aware of some of these challenges and basically conscious of them and happy to talk about them. And I think as soon as we start talking and having an open dialogue, then I think we do manage to find solutions for these things.
And is there possibly a kind of public engagement piece there as well? I don't know how much that was a feature of, say, debates around use of genetic data in the past.
I think there's a broad kind of movement around trying to be much more transparent about what you do with data generally, and that's not necessarily about some of these risks, but I think we're certainly trying to make it much more accessible to customers to understand the types of things that we do with customer data. So we created what we call the Customer Data Charter, which just says some very simple things. It sort of says we keep your data safe and secure. We don't sell your data, but we do use your data actively to try to create better products and services. We're trying to get away from just having something that looks very legalistic around terms and conditions. It's a little bit more accessible so that customers know that we are treating their data with the care that they would expect of us.
Ed, could you, I don't know how, could you talk a bit about how that works for you? I mean, you're doing quite innovative things with data for pricing for your customers. So is there a similar kind of dialogue going on there?
Yeah, so this was one of the first issues that we actually encountered when we launched our very first product. It was unique in the industry that we launched it to, the drone space, in that it provided a unique price for every given flight. And we had customers actually writing to us in the app through a little chat box that we put in there saying, I have no clue why my flight cost £5 today, but £25 yesterday. What can I do to get back to the £5 price, and how can I kind of ensure that I'm not wasting money in my insurance going forwards? This is good for me for two reasons. As a customer, I get to save money and I get to reduce my risk. So the very first thing we launched to the app was actually an attempt to make the most transparent possible communication of risk in real time to the customers, whereby we effectively broke down every single component of a flight's risk and provided it directly to our customers in their app, so they could actually scroll through and see not only every single risk, but also how every single risk was ranked and how that contributed to the price that they ended up paying for their flight. Then you get into all sorts of funny situations where you're having customers actually change their behavior, which we didn't necessarily expect to see, in order to reduce their own risk. And now we've issued over 1 million quotations through the app, and we can go back and retrospectively analyze that data and see that customers are dramatically changing the way that they behave because they want to save money on their insurance. So we've actually, and it's not just us, there are many, many companies doing this, have created a incentive mechanism that uses price and transparency in tandem to help customers understand, quantify, and mitigate their own risks. And this is where I think there's an enormous opportunity for the insurance industry to actually embrace the use of data and the use of transparency, not only to ensure risks with hyper-personalized prices, but actually to give insights to the customer and to actually empower the customer to understand and reduce their own risks. They'll pay less premiums, but they'll have less claims as well. So it's really a win-win if done well and if done sensitively. This situation can create a win-win environment whereby customers are able to reduce risks and have less claims and therefore have less disruption and risk in their personal or business lives. And insurers themselves are able to pay less claims without upsetting customers. So that's really our vision for the future of the space. That's where we'd like to see it go.
It's a great amount of go on, sorry, Melissa.
I just think that's so important what Ed just said about that win-win dynamic between the customer and the provider, and sharing those insights. And I think that's, that's one of the key points in our code of digital ethics around making that, explaining the use of AI to the customer, explaining how those data points work and affect the pricing is so key, because, and it goes back to what Orlando was saying about having the data charter and transparency being important here, because it's with that transparency you could actually change behavior and create this environment where fewer risks occur.
I mean, Ed, you were describing an amazing amount of sort of back and forth between you and your customers. Is that sort of uniform across sort of B2B and B2C customers, or do you see like more engagement with B2B customers?
So we see massive engagement from B2B customers who are really proactive about reducing their risks, because this is their livelihoods. This is their livelihoods that they're protecting. And they see us as almost a consultant in their pocket, which is fully digital, always on, able to consult 1 or 50,000 customers simultaneously with non-biased information to the extent that we can achieve that. And obviously bias in data and bias in analytics is a massive, massive topic, and one that we're striving to get right. But our B2B customers are taking these insights really seriously. From the million flights that we analyzed most recently, we saw that on average, the businesses using our product would make 15 changes to their flight. So they would change the time of takeoff, the location of takeoff, the pilot that they were using, or the drone that they were using. And they'd make on average 15 changes, and that would actually reduce their price on average by 25% from first quote to final quote. So that is a statistically significant data set, in that we this is a data set covering thousands of businesses and over 1 million flights. And we can see that the price incentive mechanism combined with the transparency has actually enabled these businesses to adjust the way that they behave, and therefore save money on their insurance.
And you've both spoken about the sort of the scale of the opportunity. So thinking about trying to get that kind of dynamic working, presumably in those really mass verticals like motor and home. I guess one question would be how to make that work with the kind of ordinary consumer, or maybe the consumer who's sort of traditionally like less engaged or has trouble engaging with insurance. So we know, for example, that like older customers are not very good engaging with their home insurance, tend to end up auto renewing each year and end up paying higher premiums as a result. So what would be a way forward for that kind of group of customers, or is there a role there for something more than just a kind of positive dynamic between the insurer and insured? Is there something that the sort of sector or regulator could do to encourage that a bit more firmly, I suppose? Anyone can jump in on that.
I think there have already been steps to make sure that people who are not engaging with insurance aren't paying very inflated prices. I think the reality to try to win customers, insurers will often offer discounts, which is very similar to other kind of retail markets, which does mean that in a second year people might end up paying more. But I think what everybody has to make sure is that doesn't keep going to a stage that feels unfair to people. And certainly we've taken some steps to try to prevent that happening, and regulators have stepped in to talk about that as well. But I think the question of whether customers get engaged with insurance at the point of getting a price, I think, is a tricky one. I think customers are very engaged at the point of making a claim, and we see very high customer satisfaction based on people that have had to make a claim. But the challenge is that nobody really wants to make a claim anyway. They're typically suffering some kind of pretty terrible situation. And so it's an unfortunate feature of the organization that actually the point of truth, the point where customers actually value us the most, are typically quite unpleasant moments. So I think part of the trick for the industry has to be to work out how we get better customer engagement over a very long period of time. People understand that really we're there to look after customers at times when they need us most, and I think really trying to push home that message, I think, is an important step for the industry.
And I'd agreed with Orlando there. We have something called the Public Trust Index, which measures the level of trust that the consumers and small businesses have in the insurance sector, and that showed that there was a high level of trust and engagement at the claim stage. But as Orlando says, it's about having that engagement earlier on. But I think this personalization presents this huge opportunity to engage, because what Ed already mentioned earlier, that people were engaging if they knew what was less risky. You've got the data. You can actually, like you said, share those insights. I personally, I wear, an Apple Watch. I would love to have the insights from my exercise regime and what I do with my watch. And I'd love someone to say, well, actually, if you just did a little bit more of this and a little bit less of this, you would have add 5 more years to your life. And I would love to know that data. And I'm sure other customers would as well. So going back to that point, I think that absolutely explaining and being as transparent as possible with customers is something that we would really urge as a professional body for our members.
And have you seen? You mentioned index of trust. What have you, just out of interest, really, is a bit of a tangent, but have you seen that changing over the last, I don't know, a few years? Like, what's the trend?
Well, I'm safe here because we've only started it recently, so and we haven't measured it since COVID started, so we might see some change there. It's hard to say at this moment.
Undoubtedly. So sticking on kind of different types of data and pricing, I think it was something, I think, Ed, you mentioned it when you were speaking just there about bias and kind of bias and pricing algorithms in particular. I think it was something that may have come up on other sessions today as well. I just wanted to touch on it. Is this something that we need to be worried about, the potential for AI pricing algorithms to be biased in particular directions? And I guess particularly we're interested here in the extent to which they might be biased against sort of protected characteristics, so biased in a way that would actually be illegal. Is that something that is of real concern, or something we think is feasible?
I think the insurance industry is quite well set up to tackle that kind of problem, because I think we're talking about AI, but in reality we're mainly talking about machine learning, so mathematical techniques to try to spot patterns in volumes of data. And machine learning techniques are evolutions of statistical modeling techniques that we've been using for many decades. So if you think about our working practices, which are set up to make sure that we have representative data sets, and to make sure that we're setting prices within agreed parameters, and to make sure that there's human oversight of some of these processes. Those are things that we've been doing for a very long time. And I think to us, we're seeing an evolution because we have vastly more data than before. We have different techniques, which might be slightly more complex, slightly harder to understand. And we have more computing power, so we can do these things much more quickly, potentially in real time. But fundamentally, we're just evolving working practices that actually have been established for many decades. So I think we're quite well set up to have the oversight required to protect against things like bias. And ultimately, we always make sure that if people only differ in terms of protected characteristics, then they do pay the same price. And I think we understand how to do that because we've been doing it for a very, very long time.
I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in on that particular point.
Oh, so obviously, treating people fairly is a fundamental principle of our code of ethics, and that the same goes for digital ethics. And having those checks and monitors over the way data is handled, going back decades, as Orlando said, but also using the new power that machine learning brings. is vital importance, and that's why we've emphasized that in our code of digital ethics, that those things like, and I think Alex in the publication that the CDEI produced as well gave some very important suggestions and of how to keep tabs on this, things like algorithmic audits, having ethics committees. All of these things are really important to make sure that there are no biases against protected characteristics creeping in.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, no one, the FCA are not here to speak for or defend themselves. Is there a sense that FCA, though, is in a position to sort of check up on this kind of thing? They kind of have the tools and understanding available to check up on these kind of issues.
Well, I think a number of regulators are getting there, and I think the ICO have published quite a few things, on auditing, the processes. And I think the reality is that it's a fast emerging area. So the transparency and the explainability of algorithms is an academic area that's moving about as fast as the development of the algorithms themselves. Mm-hmm. So I think we're all keeping a very close eye on the research. And actually, as Aviva, we've invested in some research that Cambridge University are carrying out around how we build algorithms that are fundamentally more explainable. And so I think the kind of optimistic view that I certainly take is that we should get to a point where algorithms are much more auditable than human decisions. Mm-hmm. Because as complex as they might be, ultimately we've still got mathematical formulas there, and they're consistent mathematical formulas, because if you put the same data into them, you'll get the same outcome. And so understanding those relationships is something that, as a principle, should be easier to do in an algorithm than it is in a human. So I think as long as we keep abreast of the advances in this academic research, and we keep dialogue open with all the relevant regulators, and actually where relevant, where regulators upskill themselves in terms of hiring people with the specialist skills required to understand some of these techniques, then I think we'll be in a very good place.
Yeah, great. I mean, definitely over the course of this conversation, transparency has come through as probably the strongest theme, both in terms of sort of ensuring that we're being fair to customers, but also in terms of possibly unlocking quite a big opportunity in terms of changing to a bit more of a positive, a bit more of a proactive dynamic, I guess, on pricing between insurers and their customers. I mean, so Ed, I wonder if you could comment on how do we move forward with that transparency agenda? We've heard some stuff about moving away from legalistic privacy statements, that kind of thing. Is there a role for a bit more of a broader public conversation? Is that realistic? Would it be a bit too dry and boring? So how do we move towards that greater level?
Well, it doesn't have to be dry and boring. I think if you were chairing it, it would be interesting to watch. I think one point I'll make on transparency is that so I think Orlando's point is excellent about the most complicated algorithms and the most opaque algorithms are generally in here. So there's no reason why there should be a fundamental lack of transparency built into algorithmic pricing. I think that it shouldn't be seen as rocket science to build and implement transparency. There are complicated elements of transparency which relate to the explainability of algorithms. And then there are elements of transparency which relate to combining the traditional insurance industry with more modern industries such as design, digital design, and the building of beautiful digital products and web applications which are flexible and work across multiple devices. And I think the insurance industry, this stuff isn't rocket science, but I think the insurance industry has been slightly slower in adopting these kinds of ways of working. And I think that's very rapidly changing. And I think that change is actually being brought, it is actually being expedited by the rise of insurtechs, right? These technology companies who are run by engineers and designers and product people who have burst into the world of insurance rather than the other way around. And I think that this is where the kind of combination of technology and insurance actually can do really beautiful things, not just in clever algorithmic pricing, but in just building beautiful products that can display information in a really easy to understand, easy to read way. So I'm very hopeful that there'll be a kind of explosion in transparency in the same way that there'll be an explosion in intelligence and algorithmic pricing over the next few years.
And I'd like to see an explosion in professionalism in these new entrants as well. And I've just mentioned that we've created a new charter title so that the insurtech sector, a lot of whom are MGAs, can join our ranks, and that will hopefully lead to that explosion of transparency, as you say.
Right, explosions all over the place. It's going to get noisy. That's a very positive note on which end, and I think we have pretty much hit our allotted time. I think Ben is going to come in now and wrap us up. Hi, Ben.
Thank you. What a fantastic panel, and congratulations to all of you. Now I think we can start to look forward to an explosion of questions. So that's the cue for anyone listening. Please, you've got 15 minutes. Line up your best questions and be ready to deliver them to the panel. For those of you who have the tickets, in 15 minutes time. Now, we've just had a bit of a wild ride, I guess, through questions of the value of the insurance industry to society, the importance of explainability, the particular importance of trust, and that seems to have been a recurrent theme throughout the sessions we've had today, the role of trust. Of course, it's quite right and proper that we should talk about the technology as we've done today. But I think in the point that Melissa made at the end there about the role of professionalism and the extent to which we need to be able to show our working, it's increasingly clear and increasingly important that we all need to get rather better at explaining and demonstrating the mutual benefit of what we do. And what better industry to illustrate the value and importance of collaboration and mutuality than the insurance industry. So it's been a great pleasure to welcome you here today. If you have questions and the right ticket, then please be ready to return for the Q&A session in a quarter of an hour. And in the meantime, thank you very much indeed to the panel, and thank you to all of you listening at home.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.